Hello, everybody. Recording live from somewhere. This is Zach Couples with episode number 164 of the Movement Debrief. And today, folks, there's going to be a lot of buzz about this one. Why? Because we're going to talk about carpal tunnel syndrome. Yes, folks, if you've been going on some Fortnite benders, getting a little bit of wrist pain, if you've been doing a lot of remote work, because that's how we roll nowadays, and you're getting some pins and needles and such in your hand, especially the thumb and index finger, maybe a little bit of the middle finger, and you're like, ooh, what do I do about it? Well, don't worry, folks. I'm going to tell you what you can do about it, because your boy, Big Z, has got a bunch of questions that have been asked by the people. They will be answered for the people by this people right here. Fam, recognized fam. Without further ado, let's debrief, shall we? First and only question that I got from today comes from Cadet of Space. And here's what Cadet of Space asks. How'd you go about addressing carpal tunnel syndrome? Although I don't suffer from it now as a young adult, I'm worried that if the amount of typing that I have to do for my office job may put me at a risk for developing this condition. Any thoughts? Why, yes, I do have quite a few thoughts on this, because especially with the advent of a lot more remote work, among other things, which, like those types of repetitive jobs, are a risk factor for potentially developing carpal tunnel syndrome. And so we have to look at how can we best keep the nerve that's involved with carpal tunnel syndrome, the median nerve for you nerds out there, how can we keep this nerve healthy along the way? So first, let's talk about what the heck carpal tunnel syndrome is. We'll grab the arm from Freddie Ribs to illustrate what that is. So what the carpal tunnel is, folks, is it is this part of your wrist that is kind of like right at the base. It's on the front side, or the volar aspect of the wrist. You'll see that there's like an outstretch of bones. And in that outstretch of bones, if we zoom into the anatomy proper, you're going to see that there's a band that goes over the top of those bones. And within this tunnel, it basically creates a tunnel. Within this tunnel, there are a ton of important tissues. So you have a lot of your flexor tendons within there. So things that will help flex the wrist, make fists, so you can give people knucks and all that. All of that's housed in there. The other thing that's housed in the carpal tunnel is your median nerve. And if there's increased pressure in that tunnel for whatever reason, what can happen is that can put undue strain on the nerve and lead to a few symptoms. That could be numbness, tingling, pins and needles in the index finger, the first and the second finger. That's very common. You might have some pain along the wrist and the forearm. That's also very common with this condition. And if the nerve compromise is severe enough, or the pressure is really great, you may have a tendency to dropping objects and things like that. So it can be a very serious thing if left untreated. Now, how do you treat it, first off? Well, we have to look at what makes nerves healthy. In order to have healthy nerves, you need three things. First is you need movement. The nerve needs to be able to move as you are moving. So like as I straighten out my arm and things like that, the nerve slides, it glides, it tenses, it gets smaller. There's compression that's induced, it bends, it pinches. Nerves should be able to do all these things without symptoms. And so if you can't do that for whatever reason, that could be a contributing factor to some of the symptoms. The second thing that nerves need to be healthy is space. And you can see this very easily. Have you ever had a tourniquet, or have you sat too long for an extended period of time? So think a tourniquet around your arm, or if you sit for an extended period of time and you just wait around, hang out, what happens? Well, if you got a tourniquet around your arm, say you're measuring your blood pressure or something like that, you might start getting some buzzing into your hand. If you're sitting too long for whatever reason, your foot may fall asleep, or maybe you get some numbness, tingling, pins and needles going down your leg. Well, what's going on there? Well, what's going on, folks, is you've reduced space around the nerve. When there's space reduced around the nerve, nerves don't like that. And so then they become symptomatic. Now, it should be that nerves should be able to tolerate a reduction in space to some degree. But if it's done for long periods of time, say typing for extended hours, which is a risk factor for developing carpal tunnel, or like in the case of sitting, if you sit for very long, well, the nerve eventually gets a reduction of space to it and problems ensue. So you have to make sure that there is an adequate amount of space around the nerve so it can stay healthy and get adequate, the last thing, blood flow. If nerves do not get adequate blood flow, problems ensue. This coincides with what we talked about with sitting, but also too, if you're typing for extended periods of time, in the case of the carpal tunnel syndrome and things like that, that could potentially negatively influence the health of the nerve. Three things: movement, space, and blood flow. And for whatever reason, in the case of carpal tunnel syndrome, these things are likely reduced, and that compromises the median nerve, and then you get the symptoms that you have. But now here's the thing, folks. With median nerve symptoms, most people only look at the carpal tunnel itself. And this is a very common surgery people will get. And in fact, the surgery for carpal tunnel syndrome has, at least to some of the research that I've looked at, which I'll link in the show notes. Oh, by the way, that'll be found on zachcouples.com/carpal-tunnel-syndrome. But now here's the issue. People will do surgery of the carpal tunnel, which has fairly good efficacy, actually. I think it's about like an 80% success rate and at least reduction of symptoms. But it doesn't work in everyone. And the reason why is because the median nerve just isn't at the wrist, folks. It's also going up the forearm. Oh, but wait, we're not done. It's also going up the inside portion of the arm. But wait, folks, there's more. It goes up into your neck from about the nerve roots at C6 to T5 all the way down your arm. And if there's any reduction of the ability to move, reduction of space, limitations in blood flow, anywhere along the nerve path, that could evoke the symptoms that we're talking about that are often seen with carpal tunnel syndrome. And it's a very common misdiagnosis that will happen. The worst tragedy that you can see with this particular condition is patient comes to you and they say, yeah, I just had my carpal tunnel released, helped a little bit. But then, they ended up deciding to do the cubital tunnel for the ulnar nerve because I was still getting some funky stuff in my hand. And I still got some problems. The issue may have been at the neck all along, and maybe you're dealing with a cervical radiculopathy. So you have to look at a lot of different areas because the median nerve expands a wide variety of areas. And if you skip steps and you're only focusing on one area, you might not have an accurate diagnosis. And you're probably not going to get the outcomes that you want with some of the classic interventions that we would see with impacting carpal tunnel syndrome. So, anywhere along that nerve path could be an issue. Well, great, Zach. I've been doing a lot of stuff for my wrist. I've been stretching, all that. I'm wearing a splint. I'm doing everything that I could to help with my carpal tunnel syndrome. But now you're telling me that there's all of these other influences at play. Well, what else do I have to look at then? Well, I'm glad you asked, because that's what we're going to dive into today. We're going to talk about treating carpal tunnel syndrome with a much more comprehensive approach so you can maximize your outcomes with this particular condition. Don't worry, your boy Big Z is going to walk you through it. The first thing you got to do, though, folks, before you are doing anything for carpal tunnel syndrome is you have to rule out red flags, namely serious medical stuff or nerve compromise. That could happen with this condition. Because, folks, that's why you got to have please consult a physician before doing this stuff. Because sometimes the nerve may be far gone to the point where you might be at risk for long-term nerve issues. That could be long-term weakness, long-term numbness, tingling, reflex loss. Yeesh, you got to check that stuff. And so some of the things that we want to look at when we are first evaluating someone who potentially is complaining of carpal tunnel syndrome is you want to perform a thorough neurological evaluation. meaning you want to check muscle testing. You want to check out sensory stuff to see if there's any sensory loss. Manual muscle testing is useful not because you're going to channel your inner Florence Kendall and you're at a 3+. Let's see if I can get you to a 4- by the end of the day. No, that's not what we're talking about here. You're talking about, do we have serious neural compromise? There's a significant weakness. They're gripping objects. You may want to get checked out by someone higher up on the chain. Maybe that's imaging, maybe that's EMG, something to see where the health of the nerve is at. The other thing we want to look at is make sure we're not dealing with any upper motor neuron-based stuff. So you're going to look at Babinski, you're going to look at your Hoffman's reflex, which is flicking the thumb, or flicking the middle finger, excuse me. If the thumb moves, you might have a more serious neurological lesion, and you need to get that checked out ASAP, like yesterday. Like if you flick your thumb or you flick your index finger and you notice your thumb moves, that's a big problem. Do not pass go. Do not collect $200. Get medically evaluated for this, folks. So you want to check all that stuff, because another thing too is if there's any issues with the upper parts of the nervous system, in the central nervous system or along the spinal cord, there's not much that we can do as clinicians for that. Get it checked out. Also too, you want to make sure you screen a lot of other areas besides things that are related to the carpal tunnel. So if you've scanned all your nerve stuff and things are looking okay, now we got to look at assessing the health of the nerve along its entire tract. And so that involves looking at cervical screens, so cervical range of motion. You'll want to do things to see if you're dealing with a cervical radiculopathy, because that's a very consistent diagnosis that could be manifesting with carpal tunnel symptoms. A radiculopathy is when their issue is more up at the roots of the neck, and that's leading to nervy-like symptoms. So that could be looking at seeing if you can evoke any symptoms with different cervical measures. There's Sperling's test. There's lots of different things that you can do to see if that's the case. You also want to look at range of motion along the entire extremity, not just cervical, but shoulder, elbow, wrist, and hand. All of that's going to be useful, and I'm going to explain why that is actually immensely useful when we get into treatment. The other thing you want to do to assess the nerve mobility and health as well, aside from like, did we rule out the big bad stuff, is you want to do a neurodynamic test with the median nerve biased. And so what that's going to do is that's going to assess the mobility and the tolerance of loading through the median nerve itself. And then the last thing we can do is we can palpate along the nerve tract to see if there is any potential issues at a specific area. And as you can see, we're looking at a really comprehensive, multi-structure, multi-region approach to make sure we get the best possible outcome. Because if you're just doing that, phalans and reverse phalans and stuff like that, and that's all you're looking at, where it basically puts the carpal tunnel on more strain, you're going to be missing the boat on a lot of potential influences that could impact carpal tunnel syndrome. Once we've done that, we've checked everything. So what? Now what do we do? And folks, if you want to see the median nerve test, you want to look at some of the ways that we'll look at palpating the median nerve when you look at the anatomy and where it courses. Definitely check out the show notes, zachcouples.com/carpal-tunnel-syndrome, because I'm going to have some really good videos of that. You'll get to see me with hair if you want to check that out, because these are pretty old videos, but they're still good. So you've checked all that stuff. And now you're looking at, wow, maybe I got some other things that dinged off. It's not uncommon for someone with carpal tunnel syndrome to actually have a positive neurodynamic test, meaning as you move other areas of the median nerve, you could potentially evoke symptoms. You could potentially have a situation where you modify symptoms by moving an area that's far away from where symptoms are, namely, maybe you're getting symptoms at the wrist and you move something with the head or the scapula, and that could change symptoms. Or you might have differentiations in range of motion between each area. So maybe on the left side, you have really good range of motion, minimal nervy symptoms evoked. But then when you do the right side, maybe that's the symptomatic side, you might have a significant loss of range of motion. All of those would implicate that, hey, we might have nerve issues or an inability to move the median nerve as well as we could somewhere else along the track. And so you might be thinking, cool, well, I'm going to channel my inner David Butler, and I'm going to do some slides, I'm going to do some tensionism, I'm going to do some mobilization of the nerves, right? Maybe not, even though I like that stuff, at least not right away. And I'm going to explain to you why you might not go with nerve glides right away. Here's the thing with these neurodynamic tests. So with the median nerve test, for example, if you want to go through the full excursion that the nerve ought to be able to go through, you got to move a few different areas, folks. You got to be able to extend the wrist. But then wait, you got to be able to supinate the forearm. But then also too, I got to be able to extend the elbow. And not only that, folks, but I have to be able to abduct the shoulder to 90 degrees, and I got to get 90 degrees of external rotation at the humerus. No joke. And then the last thing is I have to be able to side bend the cervical spine either direction. If I side bend away, that's going to create more strain on the nerve. If I side bend towards, that will slack the nerve, one. But the second thing that could also happen is if there is perhaps an issue with one of the joints or tissues in the cervical spine, you could actually increase symptoms because that's going to reduce space on the side that's involved. So when you're doing these neurodynamic tests, you're assuming that you have full motion at the neck and the shoulder and the elbow and the wrist. Guess what, folks? Last time I worked with someone, I ain't seen a single person have full excursion at all of those areas right from the get-go. Otherwise, they probably wouldn't be seeing me. So you have to make sure that you restore movement capabilities in each of those areas first before you go doing your sliders, your tensioners, and things like that. Because if I have a reduction of range of motion at any or all of those joints, that's going to limit how far the nerve is going to be able to move anyways. So you're going to be really doing sliding techniques at a very small range. I want big ranges. I want my nerves to move every which way they can and as far as they can without any symptoms. So when I'm looking at working with someone who has any type of nerve activity, but especially carpal tunnel syndrome, if they have a nerve complaint, we're going to look at improving range of motion in all those areas. And folks, that's where a lot of the approach that I do will live with this particular complaint. My general rules of thumb when it comes to where do we address first is I'm going to work on improving external rotation-based measures first. Flexion, abduction, external rotation. Once I've done that and we have adequate range of motion with my external rotation-based measures, I'm then going to go into improving my internal rotation-based measures after that, namely extension, adduction, and internal rotation. That's my first premise when it comes to improving the movement capabilities with this particular condition. The second thing that I will typically do is I will try to maximize range of motion of proximal structures, neck, shoulder, before I start going with a distal approach, although it's not always the case. Again, you have to have a little bit of trial and error with your supreme clientele because not everyone's going to have all of those areas restricted. And sometimes you might utilize a distal strategy and that can lead to changes proximally. Depends on, with that particular person, what area is going to be the big driver. And so you might try some techniques proximal. You might get a little bit of the way. Then you go with something distal. That might take you all the way. So you got to play around with this a little bit. Now the reason why that I go after external rotation-based measures before internal rotation-based measures has to do with when we're moving various appendages, whether it's shoulder flexion, shoulder abduction, things of that nature. External rotation actions occur before internal rotation actions. And I talk about this in another post. I'll link it if you want to get into a little bit more detail. But basically, if I don't have the ability to externally rotate, I'm likely going to utilize a compensatory strategy to get into ranges that will require internal rotation. So I always want to try to get external rotation measures before going after internal rotation measures. In the context of median nerve mobility, if we look at our neurodynamic test, if we're going to go after external rotation-based stuff first, the movements that are relevant for this particular condition will be shoulder external rotation, shoulder abduction, and forearm supination. All of those are related, to external rotation throughout the upper extremity. If you want to improve those specific measures, you're thinking, well, okay, do I do a bunch of external rotation stretches? I'm going to do some glides to get supination and things like that. Well, folks, we got to look at what factors could be influencing my ability to externally rotate. And the other principle that I operate by is I want to go after proximal-based things before distal. With that said, what is going to be the most proximal influence that will potentially limit shoulder or humeral or extremity, upper extremity, external rotation? And in my opinion, that is going to be related to your ability to put air into the upper back, aka posterior thorax expansion. Let me unpack that for you, wonderful, outstanding people. If I have the ability to externally rotate my upper extremity, humeral external rotation is also a relative scapular internal rotation. When I internally rotate the scapula, and you can see that the glenoid is pointing a little closer to you, look at the medial border of the scapula. If we're looking at a front view of the scapula, but if I internally rotate, the medial border is going to move away from the rib cage. Things that will allow the scapula to move away from the medial border of the rib cage would be rhomboids, your traps, things that run from the medial border of the scapula to the spine. Those things have to be on stretch or eccentric or long, whatever terminology you want to use, I don't care. If those are in a more elongated position, I'm going to be able to move stuff in that region more easily. The stuff that's going to move in that region is going to be air. And so if I take a breath of air in, when I have a situation where the scapula is internally rotated, the ribs are going to move posteriorly and superiorly. They're going to expand. I'm going to have adequate motion in that area. But folks, let's say that you don't have that. Let's say I have a situation where I lack the ability to push air into the posterior thorax for whatever reason. Well, what's going to happen there is now the scapula is going to be more plastered to the thorax, externally rotated. If the scapula is externally rotated, that's going to correspond with a relative humeral internal rotation. And so if this is my bias, this is my resting strategy where I have a little bit more tension towards internal rotation. When I try to go move into an external rotation-based action, I can't adequately stretch or elongate those tissues because of alterations of what's going on with the mechanics of the joints in question. And if that's going on, guess what? You're not going to be able to externally rotate. So the way that I target external rotation-based activities first is by choosing actions that will encourage posterior expansion. You could kill a lot of these movement-related birds for median nerve tests by doing something like a wall posterior expansion activity. Basically what that would be is you're going to reach in a low position, so you're thinking 0 to 60 degrees of shoulder flexion. You can even drive humeral external rotation without encouraging the upper back compressing or getting contracted. And then the way I coach it is I really flex the elbows, because with elbow flexion, you're also going to get a corresponding forearm supination. that's going to hit pretty much all of the things we need for this neurodynamic test. And so if you can do that and you start to see improvements in shoulder external rotation and forearm supination, then you got yourselves a winner. Let's say you do some stuff to improve external rotation through the humerus, but you're noticing, well, you know what, Zach, I'm not really getting the distal components. I can't supinate with the best of them yet. What might I do then? Well, maybe you still go after something a bit more proximally. Maybe you try something that has a little bit more of a rotational influence to see if you can really get the excursion. But you can also drive activities that will encourage forearm supination and elbow flexion. Those are paired actions. Something as simple as bicep curls in a low position, somewhere within the 0 to 60 range of shoulder flexion. That's going to increase external rotation capabilities because the upper back has to expand. That could be a really useful way of improving some of the distal measures. You might also get some improvements with your cervical measures as well, and you won't even have to charge your peeps extra if you check out the bicep. Because when I do flexion and rotation towards the side that's involved, that's going to open up space of the joints on that side. That could reduce some of the strain that could be occurring on the nerve exiting the spine. And hey, who's going to be complaining if you can check out your biceps, right? Pow! It's been a while. So those would be how we would improve some of the external rotation-based measures. You're externally rotating with the best of them. You got that done. Now we got to go after some internal rotation-based actions that are relevant to the mobility of the median nerve. In the neurodynamic test in question, you're looking at cervical side bending, you're looking at elbow extension, and you're looking at wrist extension. So now you're going to look at trying to drive activities that will improve each of these areas. Ones that I like that are really good for getting internal rotation-based actions could be hanging from a bar, because when I'm in that hang position, the humerus is actually going to be more internally rotated. You're going to get traction through all the joints, which will help increase space in all of those areas. The elbows have to extend, and it's going to work on improving range of motion in the rib cage areas that could impact your ability to internally rotate. Namely, in this case, it's going to improve anterior expansion in the thorax, because anterior expansion helps promote internal rotation. And you're also going to improve bucket handle dynamics as well, because some of the side bending actions that we talked about the cervical spine, well, my ability to side bend in the rib cage in total as well is also going to be associated with internal rotation. So a bar hang is a great starting point for that. You could also do things like alternating pull downs as well, because that's also going to influence your ability to internally rotate. If you got to go more distal, say you've done that, you've improved internal rotation capabilities, and neck is loosey-goosey, but you still can't extend the wrist, you still can't extend the elbow, you might go with some tricep-based activities, so you're doing tricep extensions. I would encourage doing extension with pronation, because those are paired actions. You could even do wrist extension along with that. Even some of your classic PNF patterns, so the D1 pattern, could be really useful for this. I think the terminal way that we can see with this particular condition of a way to ensure that we can perform internal rotation-based actions is by doing something weight-bearing at 90 degrees of shoulder flexion, namely quadruped. If you can do that, you're not evoking any symptoms, you probably have a rock-solid amount of internal rotation capabilities that ought to improve the structures that could impact the health of the median nerve. And that would be how I would go about improving the areas that will allow for full excursion of the median nerve when you're performing the neurodynamic tests. And I would argue that you have to have that before going after neurodynamics. Now let's say you got that, folks. Then what? Maybe you still got some symptoms. Now's the time to start throwing in some of your nerve flossing techniques. And the way that I go about that is I teach neurodynamics via a 3-step process. I'm first going to do sliding techniques or sliders because, folks, if you're going to do neurodynamics, most of the pioneers in this field are from Australia, so you have to have a little bit of an Aussie accent when you say it. I don't make the rules, that's just the way it is. But you do sliders, then you would do tensioners, and then what I like to do after that is something that challenges the load tolerance capabilities of these nerves. So I'm going to talk to you a little bit about conceptually the difference between each of these and why each one is progressively more of a challenge to the nervous system. So we have to look at how nerves move. First, I'm going to get a slider. Let's say that this Ethernet cable is a nerve. What a slider is going to do, because that's the first thing that we're going to do, is it's just going to work on moving the nerve along its path without putting an undue amount of stress. So think about sliders as increasing the excursion of the nerve. And so if I take this Ethernet cable and I put my fingers around the Ethernet cable, you could envision this as the Ethernet cable being a nerve and my fingers being a circle of stuff that the nerve has to move through. Think muscles, connective tissue, fascia, the neurovascular bundle, all of that stuff the nerve moves within. When I do a slider, all I'm doing is I'm moving the nerve along that sheath. And that's going to help restore one of the things to make the nerve healthy, namely movement. If I move the nerve, that helps keep the nerve healthy. How do I do that specifically for the median nerve? Well, I'm glad you asked. What you do for the median nerve is you take it from either end. In this case, we're looking at the wrist and the head, and you would be sliding it back and forth. So I'm going to pull tension on one side, so in this case I might extend my wrist, and then if I want to slack it on the more proximal side, I'm going to side bend my head towards. And then as I go back, I can flip that action. So now if I create tension by side bending away, I'm going to flex the wrist. And then you would do that back and forth. And what that's going to do is that's going to encourage the sliding action that the median nerve ought to be able to do without evoking any symptoms. That's a slider. It's very low stress to the nerve. It's something you want to start with first. Because when you go to the tensioners, now we're starting to put a little bit more straining through the nerve. And that's okay. Nerves have to be able to tolerate these types of actions. What a tensioner does is it pulls on the nerve on either end, and as the nerve gets pulled, what will happen is the diameter of the nerve will shrink. And so you're going to have a reduction of neural space. Well, Zach, you said that if I have reduced space around the nerve, that means the nerve's not healthy, right? If that's the resting status of the nerve, yes. But when I do things, day-to-day actions, the nerves have to be able to tense. They have to be able to elongate. They have to be able to tolerate reductions of space. How else are you going to sit on your chair for an extended period of time if you got to do that? So we want to make sure that that action of the median nerve is able to be performed without any issues. And the way I would do that specifically to the median nerve is instead of moving things back and forth, I'm going to create tension on both the proximal and the distal end of the median nerve. So that would involve wrist extension and side bending away. You might feel a little tug. You don't want to hold that tug. You're going to go slight tug and then back out of it. Slight tug and then back out of it. That helps restore the ability of the nerve to tolerate tension. Lastly, once you've done that and that hasn't led to any problems, where you would go to next is you would go after getting the nerve used to tolerating load. And what I mean by this is when we're talking about slightus, we're talking about tensioners. All of those are really low stress actions. You're just working on basic ranges of motion that the nerve should be able to tolerate. But folks, unless we're flinging yo-yos around, we're not really doing the actions that are specific to the median nerve in question. The things that are going to evoke symptoms will be day-to-day activities that we might normally do. And so when we're talking about improving the load tolerance of the nerve, we want to apply elements from the neurodynamic test, but now we want to add either moving fast, or we want to add moving heavy weights, something that's going to help us better transfer to the task that perhaps is evoking symptoms, or it could be for longer periods of time even. A move that I use could be a lift throw, because when I do a med ball lift, you can even move your head into a particular manner so it stresses the nerve even more. That's going to mimic a lot of the positions that we see with some of the neurodynamic tests. And so working that as a terminal activity could be a way to improve the nerve's tolerance to specific loading parameters. And those would be a lot of the keys that I focus on when we're talking about improving someone who has symptoms of carpal tunnel syndrome. To summarize this amazing question by the cadet, first step you want to do with carpal tunnel syndrome is you want to make sure that you rule out any red flags, make sure there's not severe nerve compromise, so do your screening. Please consult a physician before trying some of this stuff. You do that first. Then you want to make sure that you check everything along the median nerve path, because the median nerve runs from your neck to your wrist. And you could have an issue anywhere along that aside from the wrist itself, which is the carpal tunnel. Once you've done that, you then want to work on improving ranges of motion at the respective joints that influence the excursion of the median nerve, which runs from neck to wrist. So all of those joints have to have adequate dynamic capabilities. You're going to be thinking posterior expansion. You're going to be thinking about driving forearm supination and elbow flexion first. Once you've done that, then you want to improve internal rotation-based measures. Think also proximal before distal. Once you've restored joint range of motion, then you're looking at improving the neurodynamics. So you want nerves to be able to slide, you want to be able to create tension, and you want to be able to tolerate load. And if you do those things, that can significantly help with carpal tunnel syndrome. And if you've tried those things and they're not working, it may warrant going up a notch with something a little bit more aggressive. And that could be splinting, that could be cortisone, that could be, worst case scenario, surgery, but you got to make sure that you rule out some other stuff. Carpal tunnel surgery actually has some pretty good outcomes, but you want to make sure you're not that person who has to get carpal tunnel, and then you got to get the cubital tunnel, and then you end up getting the neck surgery. So amazing question. I think that's a good stopping point for us today. Folks, before you leave, the early bird for Human Matrix Las Vegas edition, which is going on December 4th and 5th, it ends tonight at 11:55 p.m. Pacific Standard Time. Sign up. If you search zachcouples.com/seminars, you can sign up for it. This one is selling like crazy. This might even sell out because we are almost topped out. I think there might be like 28 people coming to this one as of right now, which is really, really cool. So please go ahead and check that out. I do have some 2022 dates also up on the side if you're thinking of coming around that time as well. We're going to be in Seattle. We're going to be in Boston. We're going to be in Buffalo, New York as of right now. More dates to come, but please check that out. zachcouples.com/seminars. The early bird ends tonight. Give it a shot. Otherwise, thank you so much for tuning in. You've been an incredible, outstanding, wonderful audience. I hope that you keep real but not to the extent where things go wrong. Stay hungry, stay learning, stay moving, and I'll see you next time. Deuces.